So, hi again. Today,
Hi.
today my guest is Dr. Marta Miller. Good afternoon. You talked to me from New York, right?
Right.
Right. So, please introduce yourself, who you are, and what you do, please.
Yes. The name I use is Mark Crispin Miller, because without the middle name, it's very common. And I am a professor of media studies at New York University, where I've been teaching since 1997. I guess I should say that my primary specialty these days is the study of propaganda. And since propaganda is now a major problem worldwide, I've been devoting my time and energy to trying to help people understand what propaganda is, how to perceive it, how to test its truth claims, and so on, which I think is it's a critical activity that's more urgent than it has ever been.
Okay, you and other people started a website called Propaganda in Focus. I will try to share. Okay. That's it. Propaganda in Focus. These are in Portuguese because it's automatic translation, but there are many articles about COVID, about the conflict, Russia, Ukraine, and the guns, and the World Economic Forum. I advise everyone to take a time and read the articles. So, okay. So we are not used to believe that there is propaganda in the Western countries, but actually, mostly with COVID, I was shocked to notice that how weak is our mainstream media. So where we can find the propaganda, how can we see that it's propaganda? What are the signs?
Yeah, well, the signs are pretty obvious, and yet it's difficult for people to see them because we don't have any difficulty identifying propaganda that we disagree with, right? We think of it as a synonym for lying. So we're inclined to spot it, to notice it when we don't approve of it. We think the enemy is doing it. So if you ask somebody on the left for an example of propaganda in the United States, they will say Fox News, for example. And if you ask somebody on the right the same question, they'll say the New York Times or MSNBC, and they'll both be right. They're right about that. But the problem in each case is that the the person you're questioning cannot and will not see his or her own preferred media as sources of propaganda. So in order to perceive it, in order to notice it, you have to be prepared to move out of your own comfort zone. You have to be willing to suspend, if you can, suspend your preconceptions and try to be as impartial as possible. Maybe look at media that you would ordinarily stay away from, because propaganda tells you what you want to hear. That's how it works. That's why it works so successfully, is that it tells you what you prefer to think is true, see? So if you can make the intellectual effort and the emotional, psychological effort to try to think against your biases, you will notice, for example, that a particular story is everywhere. It is inescapable, right? It's all over the media, and it's the same story from medium to medium, And since the COVID rollout, amazingly, it has tended to be the same story all over the world, see? So we're sort of past the moment when we would think of propaganda as primarily the doing of national governments, as it has now become kind of a global stimulus that is the same all over the world, and even across dividing lines such as those between China and the West, for example. The COVID story in China is no different from the COVID story in the West. The COVID story in Russia and the COVID story in Ukraine are basically the same story. When you find that a particular narrative is inescapable, cannot get away from it, it is more than likely that you're dealing with a propaganda narrative, because this kind of unanimity is not natural. It's not organic. It has to be orchestrated. Propaganda works best when it is pumped out through every possible medium, nonstop, 24/7, and all the propaganda that you find censors the same material, see? So on the one hand, it tells the same story, but at the same time that it tells a particular story, it blacks out all information and evidence that might suggest that the narrative is wrong. It is blacked out. Sometimes it is pointedly ridiculed and attacked as dangerous, and the same people, the same dissident thinkers and researchers are vilified, are attacked throughout all the media, which is also unnatural. And this extends beyond the media per se to social, what we call social media, to Twitter, to Facebook, to Instagram. They tend to censor the same people. They tend to slander the same people. They will, like on Twitter, for example,
But
not only
they did a kind of agreement, right? The so-called trust initiative.
Yes, it's total agreement.
Yes.
And this is contrary, on the one hand, to democracy, because democracy usually entails and allows a variety of voices and a variety of points of view. And it is also inimical to science, because science does not say any one thing. People often say, oh, the science says this, or the science says that, or you have to follow the science. The people who say that don't understand that science is based on disagreement. Science is based on challenge, you see. So if a given researcher comes up with a particular theory, he or she expects that theory to be challenged by other scientists, expects it to be questioned, right? Real scientists expect their findings to be shot down, or for other scientists to try to shoot them down, because that's the way you determine whether or not a given notion is scientifically valid. Well, under propaganda, that's not allowed, you see. There is only one narrative. There is only one science with a capital S. It says one thing, and that is actually a hallmark of propaganda, because propaganda says one thing. Propaganda does not want an argument. Propaganda wants no argument, see? Propaganda wants you basically to obey, to absorb what the authorities are saying and listen to no one else. So it is both anti-democratic and completely unscientific, and at this point, highly dangerous to our health and freedom.
So the typical narrative in journalism have a hero, have a villain, and usually have the victim. This is propaganda or just a easy way to work? Because how the journalism come to this?
Well, that's a good question. yes, you basically made two important points, so I'll address them one at a time. First of all, propaganda always reduces the whole field of reality to one thing. It's one thing, and there's nothing else. So in the United States, for a couple of years, all the media were attacking Donald Trump relentlessly. Donald Trump was the only thing wrong with American politics. All of a sudden, George W. Bush was a wonderful guy. Dick Cheney was a wonderful guy. All these other, right-wing Republicans whom Democrats had long attacked were suddenly terrific people because they weren't Trump and they were critical of Trump. So there was Trump, 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 right? COVID, right? When they rolled out COVID, you would actually think that nobody ever died before COVID came along, that it was the first time people died. I mean, that was the impression you got. The mortality figures were grotesquely exaggerated through all kinds of dishonest means. I mean, we could go into this. It was a propaganda exercise to amplify the panic out there, right? Make people as scared as possible. So all of a sudden, COVID was worse than the Spanish flu. It was worse than the bubonic plague. It was the worst illness ever in the history of mankind. It was the only illness, right? Climate change, there is no threat to the environment other than carbon dioxide, okay? Air pollution, water pollution, radiation, glyphosate. I mean, there's a long, long list of existential threats to the environment. But under the climate change propaganda, there's only one threat, and it is global warming, see? So on the one hand, propaganda is kind of monomaniacal. It is fixated on just one thing, right? Same with Ukraine. There's no war in Yemen. There's no war in Syria. There's no war in Ethiopia. There's no war on terror. There's only Russia's heartless, brutal, neo-Stalinist attack on the democratic country of Ukraine, right? So it's one thing. And as that last example makes clear, and here I'm responding to the first part of your question, propaganda is also melodramatic. That is, it always tells a story of black versus white, of good versus evil, right? And if you disagree with it, you're evil. If you don't follow it, you're evil, right? So that is, on the one hand, something that commercial journalism naturally does, because people respond emotionally to that kind of story. But it also happens to be the way propaganda works. Propaganda never tells a complicated story. Propaganda never tells an ambiguous story. It's always an extremely simple story, a story of black and white, a story of the good versus the evil. And again, if you don't believe it, that actually makes you evil, okay? Now, this is something we've seen before in wartime. When modern propaganda first emerged on the world stage, it was during World War I. And that was the first conflict in which national governments systematically manipulated their populations in order to get them to approve of that war, which they otherwise would never have supported, okay? So that actually goes back to World War I. But what we're living through now is very different. First of all, as I've already noted, it is not any longer just a national phenomenon. It is now a global phenomenon. So that's new. And how did it happen, you ask? Well, there are a number of reasons why this has happened. First of all, for decades, the Western media has been growing ever more concentrated structurally. So by now in the West, some 4 multinational corporations, media corporations, basically determine some 90% of everything that we read and watch and listen to, online or on the radio. Okay, so that kind of structural concentration has made it much, much easier for all the media to follow a particular script. On top of that, the commercial media has had a particular problem since really the middle of the 19th century, when commercial newspapers, first took off, and that is that their content has been increasingly determined by their major advertisers as well as by their owners. Okay, so this is an old problem. In the 19th century, in the United States, patent medicines, these cheap, often poisonous and often addictive medications were sold all over the place. Patent medicine makers were the most lavish source of advertising revenue for the print press in the 19th century. Consequently, none of them ever raised a single question about whether or not those so-called medicines were effective, whether they were safe, whether they were addictive, because that industry was paying the bills, you see. Those newspapers were silent on the many, many grave dangers posed by patent medicines. And the same thing then happened from about the 1920s through the 70s with the tobacco companies, right? And now we can say the same thing is happening with big pharma and big tech, because they are enormous advertisers. They have a tremendous amount of power. Okay, now, while we have seen that kind of thing for a long time, we also have to note that the corporate media is influenced not just by its advertisers and its owners for economic reasons, but over the decades at the same time, the corporate media and the left-wing media, what we used to call the alternative media, have grown ever closer to what we call the deep state. Like in the United States, the CIA, the intelligence agencies. They have been very busy over the decades, basically turning the free press of Western democracies into propaganda outlets. And this explains why on COVID and on Ukraine and on climate change and on gun rights and on all these other issues, the left press is really impossible to tell apart from the New York Times and CNN. There's really no difference at all. And this isn't because of advertising, because the left press doesn't depend so heavily on advertising. It is rather because of their funding. They are funded by the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. People who study the history of the CIA know that those are longtime pass-throughs for the CIA. So they've been funding the left press for decades. And this explains why the left press is so bad. Now, on top of all this, the influence of advertisers, the influence of corporate owners and corporate boards, and the closeness, the close relationship between media and the government, the intelligence agencies. We've also seen the rise of fact checkers over the last 2 years, right? Fact checkers whose job is basically to debunk any story that contradicts the prevailing narrative. And the fact checkers, it is no coincidence, are largely funded by the Gates Foundation, right? And on top of all the corporate advertising that the media runs from big pharma, the Gates Foundation has spent well over $300 million for the last several years on what it calls its strategic media partnerships. And these are just basically bribes paid by the Gates Foundation to the New York Times, to the BBC, to these other outlets, which has a way of keeping them in line. Okay, they're not gonna run stories that contradict the Gates Foundation's script if the Gates Foundation is paying their bills. Okay, so these are several reasons why the media is so abysmal. It's doing such a horrible job that I don't think this is an exaggeration. Some may think it is, but I would say that the media throughout the world is guilty of crimes against humanity because they have pushed this narrative against all common sense, against all scientific consensus, against legitimate medical needs, they have systematically and consistently, at every possible chance, given people the most dangerous advice for dealing with COVID, and have systematically suppressed the most important information that people need in order to stay healthy. This has everything to do with the various structural reasons that I've just laid out, but it's important to understand that what we're living through now is sort of unprecedented. I've noted that, like in World War I and at various other prior moments of modern history, we have seen a lot of propaganda. So propaganda in itself is not new. But what is new is, I want to stress this again, the fact that this is global, okay? And the fact that this is not episodic. That is, we're used to thinking of propaganda as something that kind of flares up during times of crisis, and then, crisis ends and we get over it, we forget about it, and then years later, something else happens. So we saw this after the Kennedy assassination. We then saw this after 9/11. Decades had gone by between those two crises. But what we're seeing now is incessant. It never stops, okay? So for the last 2+ years, we have seen, this explosion of COVID propaganda, which in 2020 was all about masking. It was all about masking how good people are if they mask, how bad they are if they don't.
Yes.
That then shifted the following year into the so-called vaccines. Anyone who got them was a good person, a loving, altruistic person, and anyone who wouldn't get them is kind of an animal, kind of a right-wing animal. Then in the teeth of these drives, 2020 and 2021, we also had the George Floyd moment, which was followed by the BLM explosion, where all of a sudden, if you were a bad person, if you didn't wear a mask, if you didn't get a vaccination, you were a white supremacist, you were a racist, okay? So these two drives, they were simultaneous drives, but they fit together, they belong together. Then the same thing happened with Ukraine. A few months into 2022, when it started to look as if the COVID narrative was falling apart and as various governments were suspending their requirements, suddenly in the twinkling of an eye, the narrative changed completely. And now it was the same melodramatic story of good versus evil, right? But they fit together, right? So the COVID narrative, the Ukraine narrative, the George Floyd narrative, in the United States, the January 6th narrative, where we were told, oh, it was this attempted coup, nonsense, right? The point is that what we're living through now is a kind of rolling thunder. It never stops. They just keep changing the subject, but in changing the subject, they don't rescind the previous narratives. They don't say, oh, we were wrong about COVID, or we were wrong about the vaccines. They keep pushing them kind of in the background while the new narrative takes over. So that's new, right? So it's global. It is incessant, it never stops. And I would say the third thing about it is, the third thing that's unprecedented, is that it's driven largely by what we call the left, okay? Now I want to make something clear. All my life, I have identified as being on the left from the time I was in college in the 60s and marched with my fellow students against the war in Vietnam. We were all about civil rights. We were staunchly opposed to censorship. I am not the only person like that who comes from the left.
Me too.
Okay, good. Who cannot recognize the left. I don't know what that is, but it's not any kind of a left that I recognize. This is a left that is apparently eager for war. They seem to want to have a war with Russia, which has a nuclear arsenal. They are believers in segregation, whether it's based on vaccination status. They think that non-vaccinated people should be basically put in prison, or they are now supporters of racial segregation, coming at it from the other side. So they believe in Blacks only dormitories on college campuses. They believe in blacks only graduation ceremonies. And this is because of critical race theory, okay? So it's not a left that I recognize. They're all about censorship, okay? They want to censor everyone who isn't saying what they say, which is mind-boggling to me. But the point is that it is the left that is driving this propaganda, okay? That believes ardently in it, that wants to punish and silence those who contradict it, okay? And this is connected to the fact that the professional classes are basically guilty of enabling this long nightmare. I mean, of course, the doctors, the medical establishment, which is just as guilty as the Nazis, as the medical establishment under the Nazis. That includes journalism. I hesitate to call it journalism because there's nothing really journalistic about it. It is basically propaganda that they pump out nonstop. And as I'm unfortunately well equipped to tell you, the academy, academia, universities, where they should be, maintaining a strong commitment to academic freedom and freedom of speech. But just like everywhere else on the so-called left, so in the academy, are you risking serious career trouble if you contradict the prevailing narrative? So whether we call it the left or the professional classes, it doesn't really make any difference. The fact is that these sectors of the population are primarily responsible for the ordeal that we're all living through, and that's a new thing as well.
I don't know if this one is a stupid question, but you said that CIA somehow is pushing propaganda.
Yes.
I have the idea that CIA were spies. How this congruent? Why spies are pushing some kind of narrative about COVID? Why this happened?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. I mean, people who have not studied the history of the CIA and its adventures all over the world for the last, well over half a century, tend to be amazed by claims like the one I'm making now, because the schools don't teach that history. And with some few exceptions, the media blacks out that history. I mean, there have been some very good movies that tell accurate stories about CIA mischief, but for the most part, the CIA is celebrated and hailed in all kinds of propaganda narratives on TV and in the movies. This has been going on for decades, and the same is the case with the FBI. The American people through the 60s were unaware of the many dark doings by those agencies. And it wasn't until the 70s when certain stories came out, certain news broke that made clear to people for the first time that the CIA was operating on American soil, that the CIA was engaging in, constant propaganda, that the CIA was manipulating election results, the CIA was not, in other words, living up to its charter, which had us think that, as you say, the CIA is all about espionage. The CIA is all about spies. Most of what the CIA has done is different from that. The CIA is all about propaganda. Roughly a third of their work is propaganda related. They have done what they call election work all over the world. They have destabilized dozens of democratically elected governments all over the world. One could say that ultimately the CIA's real object of attack is not, totalitarian governments abroad. It wasn't really the Soviet Union. It hasn't really been China. Really, their focus of attack has been the possibility of democratic resistance in their own countries, in the West, you see. So if people want to understand what the CIA actually does, they have to do a fair amount of reading. They have to study up on it. in order to see that the CIA has been very, very busy manipulating the American media and the Western press generally, as well as the press throughout South America and elsewhere in the third world. They've been doing this really since their formation in 1947. This is standard practice for all intelligence agencies. It isn't only the CIA that does it. Of course, Chinese intelligence agencies do it. Russian intelligence agencies do it. Intelligence agencies throughout the West do it. This is what they do, okay? They are not a positive force for the health of Western democracy. On the contrary, they have made democracy exceedingly difficult and increasingly impossible.
But so the CIA is founded by this so-called deep state? No?
I'm sorry, ask me that again.
The CIA is founded by this so-called deep state? What is the connection between CIA and deep state?
Well, when people say the deep state, I mean, they mean several different things by that. Sometimes they mean the kind of permanent bureaucracy in Washington, right? These are people who don't go away after election results. They're always there. They're always working.
Some kind of influencers.
That's right. And so that's one way to use the phrase deep state. Others use it to refer to the intelligence agencies.
Okay.
I mean, there are 17 of them in the United States. It isn't just the CIA, but there's the Defense Intelligence Agency, and there are other covert sectors of different federal departments. You know, they're all over the place. The fact is that they constitute a sector of the government that we cannot vote out, cannot vote against them because they're not elected in the first place. I think, you know, as I use the expression deep state, I tend to mean that it is synonymous with the CIA and these other intelligence agencies. And for a very good explanation of the key role that the CIA and the Pentagon have played throughout the COVID crisis, I strongly recommend Bobby Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci.
Yes.
A great book. That was blacked out by the entire media, okay? Now, that shouldn't surprise us because, as I said at the beginning, propaganda is squarely based on censorship. It blacks out that side of the story that it does not want you to hear. So not only was the book blacked out, not only did many major bookstores in the West refuse to sell the book, but also Bobby Kennedy himself frequently, viciously attacked and vilified by the media. And this is not because they had any counter arguments. This is not because they knew he had made mistakes. The book is completely accurate. It's thoroughly and meticulously researched, and its claims are all well documented. The reason why they attack him personally, the same reason why I've been personally attacked, and Dr. Malone and Dr. McCullough and Dr. Yeadon and all these other heroic doctors have been mercilessly attacked, is that the purpose of this propaganda is not to have an argument with the other side. It is to make sure that nobody pays attention to the other side, which is different, okay? So I always say that if someone calls you a conspiracy theorist, which is one of the insults that they use, right? Implying that you're out of your mind, you're crazy, you're delusional, you know, you're given to psychotic fantasies, you wear a tinfoil hat. I regard that as a sign of, as a badge of honor and as a sign that we're doing something right, see? Because the purpose of those attacks is to try to make sure that nobody listens to us. So it is actually indirectly an admission of defeat, see? They call you a conspiracy theorist. That means they don't have anything to say against your evidence. They don't have anything to say against your argument. The fact is that you're right. And that's why you come under attack, you see, because propaganda does not work through persuasion, okay? People tend to use the phrase mass persuasion as a synonym for propaganda. That's actually a mistake, because there's nothing persuasive about propaganda. You know, who engaged in persuasion? Well, the orators in ancient Greece and in the Roman Republic. Those were persuasive exercises that the people would gather. There would be a range of speakers. Each one would make his position clear in a speech and understand in doing so that the audience could hear the other arguments as well, okay? So each orator did not try to shut the others up. It was a kind of a contest to see who could make the most compelling case. It's not what propaganda does. Propaganda wants to be the only thing you hear. It wants to give you the only narrative that you're allowed to listen to. And if you don't follow it, if you don't obey it and believe it, you will suffer. You will be punished, you know, and that has happened to countless people.
So thank you so much for this conversation. Where can we find you?
Well, I'm on Substack. You know, I basically circulate my own writings through Substack, and people can subscribe there. And I also have a listserv called News from Underground. It's basically just emails that I send out every day, alerting people to important news that's been either blacked out or misreported. And if people want to get those emails, they can go to markcrispinmiller.com and sign up there. And I recommend that if you do sign up for my listserv, that you choose the daily digest option. Otherwise, you'll get each email that I send out one at a time. And if you don't like to have your inbox fill up with that stuff, if you ask for the daily digest option, you'll just get one email in the evening with all that day's emails in it.
Okay, thank you so much. Keep the fighting, all right? We need people like you, and try to give the other side. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And you keep it up too.
Bye.
Bye.